The Jewish people spent 210 years in Egypt, which was considered the years of bondage. The enslavement did not start immediately. The Torah says explicitly, it was only after the generation who had come to Egypt had passed away, only then did the bondage start as slavery. With the Jews, they were bound to produce quotas of mortar and brick. And if they did not, they were beaten, maybe even killed. They demanded those quotas. The Torah tells us that as they increased the severity of the bondage, the Jews proliferated even to a greater degree. Initially, who's the one who came up with this so-called final solution? Because the Torah gives us the background that when the Jews began proliferating, the Egyptians were concerned, Paro was concerned, that the Jews will outnumber them and ultimately will be a fifth column in Egypt, in Egyptian society, and collaborate and join forces with their enemies and force them out of the country. And they'll overthrow the government. So the only way to deal with it, we have to somehow get them under control. So the Medrash tells us that Paro had three advisors. One was Bilam, the prophet of the nations, who was a rabid anti-Semite. He was the antithesis of anything that represented God. Then there was Yisro, who ultimately was the father of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then there was Yisro and Bilam. They were the advisors. When Bilam and there was Job. Job was the third advisor. Bilam came up with the solution: enslave them. That's the only way we can control them. And putting an enormous physical strain on them, that will, because a human being only is able to procreate in a healthy way only if he's physically fit. But if his physicality is overtaxed through overwhelming and overbearing slavery, they're not going to be able to procreate. They're not going to be able to proliferate. And that was the whole idea, to limit their numbers through the bondage. But so Bilam, that was his suggestion. Perach, avodas perach. The word perach means work that's backbreaking. It takes the human being and literally pulverizes him. That's the level of work. And Paro embraced it. Yisro, in protest, fled. He fled Egypt. He couldn't tolerate the miscarriage of justice. To take an innocent people, one whose family member saved Egypt. If not for Yosef, Egypt would have perished in starvation during the famine. And you take an innocent people because of your concerns, which they've only demonstrated the level of selfless commitment to the country, to the civilization. How do you enslave an innocent people? Yisro could not tolerate it. He fled. Job, Shosak. Job remained silent. Okay? Factually, it was instituted. The bondage was instituted. As they enslaved them and they increased the intensity of the slavery, rather than minimizing them, they increased the number even to a greater degree. It was unbelievable. It's like you can't stamp out these Jews. As much as we try to get rid of them, you can't. So the whole plan backfired. The more they enslaved them, the more they increased the number. So the Rechaim HaKodesh explains that, let's say they set certain quotas, and they said, you must meet these quotas. But as they saw they were able to meet the quotas, they advanced the quotas even to a greater degree. You know what God does? No problem. I will provide more manpower. So the reason why they increased the number, God was increasing the manpower based on what? On the quotas that they kept upping the quotas. So actually it was like they were shooting themselves in their own leg. Here they're trying to minimize them through overwhelming, unbearable, inhuman torture by taxing the system, and just to the contrary, it's increasing their number. They couldn't deal with it. Okay? But one positive side they saw, the Jewish slave population was the backbone for the Egyptian economy. You know what kind of workforce they had? Millions and millions of people being productive. Unbelievable how financially they're advancing. Okay? So now they don't want the Jews to leave. They're not worried the Jews are no longer a threat. They have them under control. The numbers are okay. All of a sudden now, the astrologers of Egypt read the zodiac, the stars, and it says, the Redeemer of Israel is going to be born. And once he comes, the Egyptians' moment of glory is over. He will take the Jews out of Egypt. What happens if he takes Jews out of Egypt? Literally, it's the equivalent of pulling the plug on the Egyptian economy. There's no way they're going to allow this to happen. So what do? They put out a decree that every Jewish male child who's born should be thrown into the Nile. That was the decree they gave. And that will nip it in the bud. Because if there's no Redeemer, there's no Exodus. And they gave a decree, every Jewish child born, male, we throw him into the Nile. But initially, before they did that, which was open genocide, they summoned the two Jewish midwives who oversaw all the thousands and thousands of midwives who were delivering children in Egypt. One's name was Shifra, and the other's name was Pua. That were their Hebrew names, Shifra or Pua. And he says to them, when you see the woman on the birth stool about to give birth, when you see it's a male, kill the child. And kill it in a way, in such a discreet way, the mother won't even realize that you killed the child. And if it's a female, a girl, let it live. Okay? And he summons them, and he dictates it to them. And Shifra and Pua, they go, and they don't listen. And it says, because Vatireno Hamayaldos Es Elokim, because the midwives, they feared God, they did not listen to the dictate of the king of Egypt. Did not listen to it. And he summons them afterwards when he realizes it's not working. They defied his dictate. Is why didn't you listen? He says, you don't understand. The Jewish women, just as an animal doesn't need anybody to deliver its offspring, the Jewish people, they deliver their own children. We're different than you people. Therefore, we don't have a moment, we don't have a chance, we're not able to carry out your dictate. But initially, he wanted to do it discreetly, that they should retain their humanism, so to say, but factually, they're committing genocide on the QT. When he saw that didn't work, and the Jewish population may immediately exit through Redeemer, he's openly kill the male children, just throw them into the Nile. That was the decree he gave. Because the Vatirena Mials Es Elokim, the Jewish midwives, because they feared God, they did not listen to the decree of the king. Now, the question is, why did he choose water? kill the male Jews, children, newborns with water. He could have said, let's make a big fire, just throw them into a fire. You kill them by the sword. Why did he choose water? Now, the Egyptians' understanding of the Jewish God was that this power, they didn't believe that he was different than any other deity, any other power. And just like deities, there's a struggle among the deities, but this deity, this power, which they call the God of Israel, when he avenges the wrong, he always avenges it within the context of measure for measure. Measure for measure. So Pharaoh was no fool. You got to cover all your bases. He said, if we kill the Jews with fire, God will destroy us with fire, because that's measure for measure. If we kill them with the sword, he will have us killed by the sword. But if we kill them with water, drown them, he can't come back at us. Why? Because God had made a covenant with existence that he will never bring a great flood upon the world to destroy the world. And since Egypt is the height of civilization, and if Egypt is inundated with a flood, it's the equivalent of destroying the world. And God is bound by his covenant. Therefore, we outsmarted God on this one. When we kill the Jewish children, it will be by water. We've outwitted him. But you realize, you never outwit God. Now, we find the Egyptians, when the Jews left Egypt, God said to them, I want you to borrow their personal effects, their gold and silver vessels. That's what I want. And initially it wasn't so simple. The Jews would borrow it. Why? Because after the 10 plagues, Egypt was reduced to rubble. But factually, if they have personal capital and valuables, they could rebuild. But when the Jews left, they depleted the country. They took all the wealth. And they said, we're coming back. But when they realized they're not coming back, they're going to pursue them. So the Jews initially didn't want to borrow. It wasn't so simple. They were going to borrow the gold and silver vessels. Because each Egyptian has his axe to grind, and he's coming after the Jew to regain his personal valuables. But the Jews borrowed. And when the Egyptians realized they were duped, they began pursuing the Jews. And where did they pursue them into? Into the Red Sea. God says, not a problem. I made a covenant with the world. I will not bring the great flood upon mankind. But you know something? You guys are coming to the water. The water's not coming to you, but you're going to the water. And that's the reason why I told them to borrow the gold and silver vessels, that should be the bait, to bait them, to draw them into the sea, so the sea should close on them. And that's the measure for measure. As you killed my children, your armies and your glory is going down in the sea. That is the measure for measure. So the Jews are enslaved. And the Redeemer of Israel, they wanted somehow, they're hunting him. And hopefully, by drowning every Jewish child, male, they will solve it. But you know what happened? As much as they were drowning and killing the Jewish males, the astrologer said, he's still alive. We see in the stars, he's still alive. And it came, he says, he's born today. So the day he was born, they gave a decree that not only the Jewish males should be killed, even the non-Jewish males. Why? Because they were not sure if the Redeemer of Israel is a Jew or maybe a non-Jew. So if that's the case, we can't take a chance. So the decree was kill all male children being born that day. Okay? The Torah tells us that who are the parents of Moshe? Amram was his father. Yocheved was the mother. The Torah tells us that Vayelech ish mi beis Levi, Vayikach bas Levi. A man of the house of Levi, he was a Levite. he went and he married the daughter of Levi. Yocheved was born as her mother passed through the walls of Egypt when they came to Egypt with Yaakov as a grandchild. Abram is identified as a person from the house of Levi, took the daughter of Levi. And guess what? They had a child. But you realize, and the child was born prematurely, 3 months early. So they were able to conceal his birth for 3 months because the Egyptians only sought out the children only when after being a full-term birth. They didn't suspect that maybe he was born earlier. Moshe was born prematurely. So Yocheved was able to hide him for 2 months, almost 3 months. When the 9-month time came, the Torah tells us she fashioned a box, put him in the box, put him into the Nile. Okay? When Yocheved put Moshe in the box, his name wasn't Moshe yet. We'll discuss what his name was. And as she put him in the Nile, the astrologers of Egypt said, Meis Moshe Shel Yisrael. The savior of Israel just died. No concern any longer. We could sleep at night. The Jews are here forever. Because without a redeemer, they're not going anywhere. Paro was very happy. All of a sudden, Torah tells us a story. The daughter of Paro is bathing in the Nile with her maidens. And she sees something peculiar, a box floating in the water. And she opens the box and she says, this is a Jewish child. Miyaldeu Ivrim. She's from the children of the Jews, of the Hebrews. She took him and she adopted him as her son. And this was the most favorite grandchild of Paro, the Jewish grandson. Adopted. Paro himself. Originally, so who is he adopting? The Redeemer of Israel, thinking that he's no longer alive. Well, the astrologer said, there's nothing to be concerned. Little did he know that under his nose, this is the Redeemer of Israel. How could the astrologers be so wrong? These people were expert astrologers. No one who was more advanced in astrology than they were, and yet they missed it. Did they miss it? Or it was not possible to know through astrology? Now, what is astrology? What is it? We're not talking about Gene Dixon here. No, that's not astrology. We're talking about the real thing, the real science. As the Torah tells us, Avram Avinu was an expert astrologer. The astrologers of Egypt were expert astrologers. And the star said, the Redeemer of Israel was born, he must be killed. They said, the star says, the Redeemer of Israel died. He's no longer alive. Now, let's understand. What exactly are the functions of stars? Why did the stars foretell the reality of existence and even the future of existence? What's the reason? So the way it's explained that how does existence manifest itself? God releases energies in the spiritual realm. These spiritual energies, forces, have to undergo certain levels of conversion. The stars are the conversion process to take these spiritual energies to convert them into physicality. So anything that goes through the stars, that's the conversion location. It becomes what it's meant to come. It's like you cast a die, and then you take the die, you're able to manufacture, reproduce whatever that die is. These energies are spiritual profiles of what physical existence is supposed to be and to function in that context. The stars are the processing centers to bring about this conversion into physicality. What do you think you have? Trillions of stars, or even beyond that. Do you know how many components there are to this physical existence? Not even, I'm not even talking about classifications. Within each classification, there are endless species belonging to that classification of species. Each species has to have its own energy to convert it from spiritual to physical. Granules of sand, species of fish, insects, reptiles, people, everything. Minerals, water, everything, birds. So how many conversion centers do you need? Endless. Because all the stars, but when you look at that star, what do you see? You see exactly what it's meant to be. The energy that brought Moshe Rabbeinu into existence. When that star was turned on, it read, Redeemer of Israel. One of a kind of human being is coming into existence now. That was the energy God provided for it to happen. Okay? That's how they read the stars. So what are the stars? The world itself functions on a natural level. Doesn't function on a supernatural level. Supernatural doesn't go through the normal protocols of conversion from spiritual to physical. It happens unrelated to the stars. So Moshe, as a human being, as a child being born, a person put into a box, as insulated as may be, is the equivalent of the death sentence. He's going to drown. Why did Moshe not drown? It was a miracle that he didn't drown. He should have drowned. We find by the plague of blood, Moshe did not strike the Nile, because it would have been an expression of an ingrate if he would have, because Moshe miraculously didn't drown. What do we direct? His mother made a box. She made a box for him. As much as she provided that floating device, he should have drowned. So that he did not drown, that was a miracle. Anything which is supernatural, that evades the radar. That doesn't go through the stars. So what did the stars say? A newborn child was just put into the Nile. His life, if that's the case, being put in the Nile, that means your life is ended. Therefore, the astrologers, what did they say? What did the stars say? The Redeemer of Israel has just died. But he was alive. So in terms of themselves, convinced. There's nothing to worry about any longer. I just want to get back to another point. I had mentioned Emor Rabbeinu Bachio that the appellation, the title for every Egyptian monarch was Paro, Pharaoh. Why was that the name? Why was that the title? They have Ramses, New Jersey, Okay, you have all kinds of names. But the all-inclusive title was Pharaoh. What does Pharaoh represent? So Rabbeinu Bachia explains that the Egyptian culture, civilization was based that nothing exists outside of the physical realm. Nothing. There's no such thing as a spiritual realm. Everything functions within the order of nature. Nothing outside. The letters in Paro are Aleph Pei Resh. Aleph Pei Resh spells Ophir, earthiness. Everything is earthy. There's nothing outside of the earthy existence. Witchcraft is manipulating the forces of the natural order. That's what witchcraft is. But something which transcends and is not bound to the natural order doesn't exist. So when we speak about evading the radar, in the Egyptians' understanding, nothing can evade the stars. Because the stars are the processing center of all these energies which bring physical into existence. And there's nothing outside of the physical. So if that's the case, if Moshe is alive, the stars should have transmitted that information? Why didn't it? The answer is it's miracle. Miracle transcends the physical, but they didn't believe there's anything outside of the physical that's able to transcend the physical. Therefore, they were convinced impossible Moshe could be alive, because otherwise the stars would have transmitted that fact, that information. That's the understanding. Therefore, Bas Paro, the daughter of Paro, she bathes him. She sees he's a Jewish child. Not a problem. Her father has no problem retaining him and adopts him as his grandchild. But it's very interesting. The Talmud tells us, why did she go to the Nile to bathe? So the Gemara tells us, initially she was a pagan. She was an idolater. She went to bathe in the Nile to purify herself, because she became a monotheist at that moment. She rejected paganism. And therefore her name, the daughter of Paro's name was Basya. Basya is Basko, the daughter of God. At that moment, she rejected idolatry. Going to immerse herself in the Nile was an act of conversion, to become a monotheist. Right after she becomes a monotheist, all of a sudden she sees a Jewish child. What do the Jewish people represent? They are the founders of monotheism. Therefore, as a result of that, when she saw the Jewish child, she took special pity on him, and she had special mercy for him, because that's what it's all about. If it would have been maybe any other time, and she would have been an ardent pagan, hard, fast, uncompromising pagan, she's a Jewish child. It's nothing. Without any conscience, she would have turned over the box and he would have drowned. But it happened to be at the moment that she comes to the moment of truth and she's purifying herself to enter into the classification of a monotheist. All of a sudden she notices this peculiar scene, a box floating in the water. And what did she find in the box? A Jewish child. She immediately retrieves it and wants to adopt the child. But getting back, who are Moshe's parents? The Torah identifies them. A man of the house of Levi took the daughter of Levi. So the Maral of Prague asks, look, they had a name. Torah says, Yelech Amram, the father of Moshe went, and he took Yocheved. Why are we keeping it so-called under wraps what the parentage of Moshe is? A man of the house of Levi took the daughter of Levi. Let's identify him by name. Amram, who was a Levi, took Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, as a wife. And they had a child. So Maral of Prague says something very, very profound. Very often, Moshe Rabbeinu was a miracle child. We find in the portion that when he was born, as he came out, it says the whole house radiated from holiness. He was born with the divine presence. He was naturally, Moshe Rabbeinu had the most special soul, one of the most special souls that ever existed. Moshe's dimension of being, as we see later, was the equivalent of the whole Jewish nation combined. That was his dimension of spirituality. So this child that's born now, what is his spiritual capacity? His spiritual potential. It's multiples of all the Jews combined. So when he was born, it says the whole house began glowing from holiness, from Kedusha. What were the names his parents gave him? His parents gave him a name. The name his parents gave him was not Moshe. Moshe was the name that the daughter of Pharaoh gave him. The name his parents gave him, one of the names was Tov. Because it says they saw he was good. Tuvia. Tuvia is a Hebrew name. Tov Ko. Tuvi. All connotations of the ultimate to indicate goodness. Now, very often, a couple has a child, the characteristics and the special attributes of the child are attributed to the parents. If the Torah would have written Amram of the house of Levi went and took Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, and then they had this very special son. What would you attribute the specialness, the qualities, the characteristics, and his dimension of being? What would you attribute it to? It has something to do with the parents, as usually it does. Torah says no. Moshe's dimension of being is unrelated to his father, unrelated to his mother. Moshe had to be born. That soul had to come to existence because he's going to be the redeemer of Israel, and ultimately he's going to be receiving the Torah at Sinai. That dimension of person is not relevant to anybody. Who merited to bring that soul into existence? That was a person of the house of Levi and the daughter of Levi. Because if they be identified by name, you would mistakenly think that his innate qualities and capacity and dimension of spirituality has something to do with the father and the mother. Torah says that has nothing to do with them whatsoever. Therefore, it's generic. A person of the house of Levi went and married the daughter of Levi, not identifying them by name for that reason. This is the Maral of Prague. The Midrash tells us the day Moshe Rabbeinu was born, he spoke on that day. He spoke. He was fully intelligible at that time. You know, it's interesting. The Talmud tells us that before a child is born, an angel teaches the child the Torah in entirety. And the child has a level of clarity of one of a kind. It says he sees from one end of the world to the other. The moment before the child is born, the Malach touches the child's mouth, forgets everything. What would be if the Malach wouldn't have touched a child's mouth to cause him to forget? And he'd have that level of clarity. He's proficient in every level of Torah. He has an understanding. There's nothing which is occluded from his understanding. And he speaks. Why doesn't he? Because it's like amnesia. The Malach touches the mouth, it's over. It's like it never happened. Moshe Rabbeinu, it's like the Malach never touched his mouth. He came out fully functional, fully grasping, fully intelligible, with that dimension of holiness that he radiated. When Yocheved when the daughter of Paro opened that box, he knew he was special. Why? Because she saw the radiance of the child. She saw his holiness. And therefore she said, this is definitely a Jewish child. Because no Gentile child has that level of radiance. I'll tell over a story, which I've told in the past. The Rebbe of the Chofetz Chaim, when the Chofetz Chaim was about 16 years old, his name was Rab Nochem Huradna. Rab Nochem, he came from a city called Huradna in Europe. Who was this Nochem Huradna? And the only picture the Chofetz Chaim had in his house, if you could see it today, the book's printed, biographies on the Chofetz Chaim, there's a picture of the Chofetz Chaim's Rebbe in that book. Rab Nochem Huradna was a shamus in the shul. Shamus. He was one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim. The 36 concealed, devoutly righteous people. He was one of them. And he himself was a shamus in the shul. What would he do? Every time they would come, he would open the shul in the morning. He'd put out the Sidurim, the Svarim, the books. At the end of the day, he'd clean up, put everything back on the shelf, clean up the shul or the Beis Medrash, lock the door, close the shades, make sure the oven was fueled to provide heat, and that was his responsibility. But the Chofetz Chaim, even as a young man, suspected there's something peculiar in the positive, something very special about this man, and something's being concealed. And he suspected it. So what did he do? He went and he hid right next to the oven, between the oven and a pillar, and he wedged himself in there, that nobody knows that he's hiding there. After Ma'ariv was over at night, Rab Nochem Huradna starts putting away the Sidurim, the Chamoshim, whatever Svarim they used, locks the door, closes the window shade. And he goes to the middle of the shul, and he goes to the bima, and he starts chanting certain verses and saying certain phrases. All of a sudden, the shul starts glowing like an inferno was burning, literally glowing. Chofetz Chaim immediately knew this man is a holy man. This is unbelievable. He's never seen anything like this in his life. Soon after he finishes studying whatever he was studying, the Kabbalistic works, the Chofetz Chaim comes out from hiding, and Rav Nachum is like shocked. His game is up. He caught him in the act. So he says to Rav Nachum Radna, I want to be your student. Accept me to be your student and mentor me. And Rav Nachum Radna agreed. Okay? That's how the Chofetz Chaim became a student of Rav Nachum Radna. So when Rav Aaron Kotler heard the story, he was like amazed. The Chofetz Chaim was 15 years old, 16 maximum. He says, Rav Aaron, I'm not amazed that Rav Nachum Radna, when he studied, the shul began glowing. But what I'm amazed is that the Chofetz Chaim at the age of 16 was able to be privy to that, see that radiance. That's what I'm amazed at. Although he's only 16, he was able to see it. Like we find by the Akedah, when they came to Mount Moriah, Har Moriah, Avram says to Yitzchak, what do you see? He says, I see a cloud over the mountain. He says to Yishmael and Eliezer, especially as Eliezer was, what do you see? They said, we see nothing. So to be able to see something of a certain dimension of wholeness, you have to be at a level and privy to that. And even Eliezer didn't see it. That the Chofetz Chaim was able to see this holiness, this radiance, at the age of 16, tells you who the Chofetz Chaim was. That's Rav Aaron Kotler's comment. Bas Paro. She opens the basket. She says, Miyaldei Ho'ivrim. This is a Jewish child. Why? Because she saw the radiance in the basket, which was the divine presence. What does it say about her? She's a pagan, an Egyptian woman. What does she see? That she was privy to it tells us she was Bas Koch. She was a convert, but at a level of holiness. She had a capacity and a worthiness to be able to see that holiness. Not only that, she had the privilege to save the Redeemer of Israel, and it's due to her, that he was actually raised in the palace of the king because of what she did. Who has this kind of privilege? You have to be privileged to have this kind of privilege. So that speaks volumes of Bas Paro, of Basio. She's the daughter of God. That's who she is. No, you read the Torah story, the Seder, Chad Gadya, Dayenu. You got frogs jumping on the table. He's giving out the toys. Toys R Us, Schwartz, FAO Schwartz, all this kind of stuff. The only thing that's missing is the Broadway show at the Seder for these people. That's what the Seder is. It's understanding what the reality is, what the fabric of our heritage is, where it began and how it began. That's what it's about. Moshe Rabbeinu now, he's born, so he needs a wet nurse. So who waited to see what was going to happen? Miriam, his sister, waited nearby to see what was going to happen. She stood at a distance to see if Moshe is going to be retrieved, because he could have drowned. And he sees the Egyptian princess takes him, and she goes over to her and says, do you need a wet nurse for the child? She says, yes. She says, I have the perfect wet nurse. And that was Yocheved, the mother of Moshe. And she nursed him. He would not nurse from a Gentile woman as a newborn. Why? So Rashi cites the Midrash. Because the mouth that will speak with the divine presence will not have milk of a non-Jewish woman touching his lips. Therefore, he would not nurse as a newborn. Yocheved nursed him. When he was fully weaned from his mother, she brought him to Bas Paro. And she shared with him. She knew that he was his mother, because Bas Paro was a devout convert. And she understood it very clearly what was going on. Now, there's a discussion in the Midrash. The wood which Yocheved had purchased to build this box, this cradle, when she put it in the Nile, she builds it, and Torah makes it a point, and she waterproofed the inner part of the box. Okay? She puts him in, and he's found by the Egyptian princess. How much did she spend on that wood? Did she get the best quality wood, or she bought the most inferior quality wood? One opinion is she purchased the best quality wood. Your son, put him in the Nile. Of course, you do your best. The other opinion is she bought the most inferior quality wood. Why? Because why waste your money? Because tzaddikim, chavivim mamonim yosim mitufan. A tzaddik, he values his money as much as he values his life. A Jew is not wasteful. So the obvious question is, we're talking about saving your son. This is wasteful. Maybe you should skimp on your newborn's food because, money is very important. And what? And the child should never develop and be malnourished. How do we understand this? Because the Jew values his money as much as his life, because you never know when you need those extra few kopecks. Therefore, you skimp on the quality of the wood. How do we understand this? It sounds absurd. The answer is, as we said, Moshe not drowning was a miracle. It was a miracle. You could have gotten the best floating device, he would have drowned. It was only due to divine intervention he did not drown. Why didn't he drown? Because Moshe was the Redeemer of Israel. And Moshe being the Redeemer of Israel, he could not drown under any circumstance. If Yocheved would have taken and put him directly in the water, he wouldn't have drowned. Because he's the Redeemer of Israel. So if that's the case, why should he even build a box? The answer is, as the commentators explain, because whenever a miracle has to take place, we always have to try to conceal the miracle. So by creating the box, the floating device situation, you're concealing the miracle. Because if God's presence is overtly, undeniably there, it undermines one's free choice. God's presence always has to be in question. And it's you to take the initiative to recognize, despite the concealment. Therefore, Yocheved had an obligation to buy a box. So what exactly is the objective of purchasing of this wood? If it's only to conceal the miracle, and buying the most inferior quality wood would be sufficient, spending a cent more than that, you know what that's called? It's called being wasteful. So that's that opinion. Moshe definitely was going to live because he's the savior of Israel. He will be the Redeemer. And Yocheved knew this. When he was born, the house was illuminated. He knew it immediately. And Yocheved at the age of 6 was a prophetess. And she said when originally Amram divorced his wife, when the decree was to kill the Jewish males, she said to her father, your decree is more harsh than Pharaoh's decree. Pharaoh only decreed on the males. You decreed even on the females. And she said, our mother is meant and you to father the Redeemer of Israel. So they knew Moshe when he was born, he was the Redeemer. So if that's the case, no question, he's living, no matter what. So what is the value of creating the box? Purely to conceal the miracle. Doing more than is necessary is just being wasteful. Therefore, as a result of that, what quality wood did she buy? The most inferior quality wood for that reason. Okay? It says, Miriam stood at a distance to see what was going to happen to Moshe. And immediately she approaches, says, do you need somebody, a wet nurse? She said, yes. And she says, I will pay the fee, whatever the cost of the wet nurse is. That's what Bas Paro, the daughter of Paro, said to Miriam. It says she stood at a distance to watch, to see what was going to happen. It says what she watched, she was wailing. The Midrash says Miriam was crying. What is she crying about? You know what she's crying about? And it says, she waited to see what will happen. Fast forward, 80 years later, more than 80 years later, almost 120 years later, They're in the desert. And Miriam speaks out of turn about her brother Moshe. She becomes a leper. What happened when she became a leper? She had to be sent out of the camp until she recovered from the leprosy. It says that the divine presence waited for her, the clouds of glory waited for her, and the Jewish people waited for her till she was reinstated into the camp. Because a leper is out of the camp. Why did she merit that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, should wait for her in her honor, the clouds of glory, and the Jewish people? So the Midrash says, just as she waited to see what was going to happen to her brother, measure for measure, you waited to see what will happen to your brother. Hashem says, we will wait to see what happens to Miriam. We will wait for Miriam to be reinstated. What's the measure for measure? I waited in line to buy bananas or to buy bread in the health food store. Organic bananas and bread made from rice bread. You waited. Something? If that's the case, the whole Jewish people should wait for you. What does that waiting have to do with this waiting? Well, they're both waiting. The answer is what? It says she was crying. Why was she crying? Miriam prophesied that this is the Redeemer of Israel. If Moshe drowns, God forbid, the Jews are there forever. There will never be a Jewish people. There will never be a Sinai. She was crying for God's glory. She was crying for God's sake. A person who internalizes that reality to such a level and waits for that, the whole Jewish people, they should wait for her, and I will wait for her, and the Lord's clouds of glory will wait for her. And only then will we continue to travel, because she's worthy of that honor, of that level of recognition. Because she, at the age of 6, already understood, God forbid, what it meant if Moshe would, God forbid, drown, that there is no future. Existence will not meet its objective because there will never be a Jewish people, because Moshe was the only qualified person to take the Jews out of Egypt for that reason. That's the measure for measure. It's very interesting. The man of the house of Levi marries the daughter of Levi. Who are they? Amram, Yocheved. They have 3 children. Moshe is the greatest human being who ever lived. Aaron, the equivalent of Moshe in a certain context. Miriam, each child in his own right, were one of a kind in the history of the Jewish people. How does one couple merit to have such special children? These are, the word mega is a disrespect to refer to them. These are people of a dimension of existence that we can't even relate to who they were. And the couple merit to have 3 such exceptional children. They are the leaders of the Jewish people. After the sea split, Moshe said the song with the men, Miriam led the women in song to say the song at the sea. The wellspring in the desert was in her merit. The clouds of glory were in the merit of Aaron. And the manna was in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu. How does such a couple merit to have such special children? Now, originally, Paro says to the midwives, I want you to kill the male children on the birth stool. And when Paro spoke to them, if you look in the verses, he spoke to them as the king of Egypt. When the king of Egypt speaks to you, you actually melt in his presence. Yocheved and Miriam did not melt in his presence. You know why? Because because they said, in their minds, you're a mere mortal. We fear God. And in God's presence, you're nothing. And you all are only there because God put you there. And they internalized that was the reality. Therefore, they weren't intimidated. To do something so unconscionable, regardless of what the consequences will be, no way, we will never do it. And it says they did not heed the word of Pharaoh to kill the male children. And it says, So why is there a Jewish people? If God forbid, if they would have chosen to kill the Jewish males, you realize there wouldn't have been a Jewish people. There would only been the females. The females would have married Egyptians. There's no future. So why is there a Jewish people that exists to leave Egypt to go to Sinai? You know whose merit? Yocheved and her daughter Miriam. Yocheved being the head midwife. A woman who's responsible for the existence of the Jewish people, she will merit children who are the equivalent of the whole Jewish people. And that merit, she merited Moshe Rabbeinu. That she should have the merit, he has to be born to existence. But in her merit, she's meritorious sufficiently, he will come through her. She will bear that child. Amram, being the leading Torah sage of the generation, advising the Jews how to behave and not behave. This couple, they will merit to be the parents of the most special children outside of the 12 tribes in the history of the Jewish people. But it's all merit, it's all measure for measure. In life, you do great things, Hashem pays you 500 times, the Talmud says, more than you've accomplished. That's measure for measure. Rule of thumb, you worry about God's children, God will worry about your children. You care for other Jews, God will care for you. That all goes into measure for measure. Although we see things which sometimes are not understandable, may be really contrary to what I just said. You understand? We don't get the full picture. You never know. You never know how it adds up. Nochem imish Gamzu. Nochem, the man of Gamzu, who was the Rebbe Reb Kiva, said, no matter as bleak as it was, the man is going to the gallows. Gamzu Latova. It's for the best. And it always turned out to be for the best. That's what it was. So although we don't understand why, because sometimes there's a little kink in the chain, doesn't make a difference. There's always measure for measure. And the measure takes it over the top and beyond over the top. So today's day and age, where the forces of assimilation, of materialism, of hedonism are so overwhelming, all subsuming and consuming, if we're able to put a dent in that by saying a word to another Jew, which maybe will give an iota of curiosity to look into his Judaism. What is the value? How does Hashem see that? You're trying to save my child. What about if you truly put yourself out and there's a monetary expenditure? What about if you're willing to even put your reputation on the line, to be disgraced, to be discredited, for being seen as a fanatic? I mean, you're that provincial Jew. You're that backward person. You're that archaic person. You're the this. No, you could think whatever you want to think, you could think who I am. I am who I believe I should be, and that's what I'm doing. And I'm putting my eggs where they're supposed to be put, in the right basket. I'm not sure where you put your eggs, in which basket. But I know my basket is the right basket. You disagree, you have a right to disagree. But I also have a right to disagree. Just to end with one story, many years ago, there was a woman who came to Yad Avram. Story goes back 35 years ago, more, 37 years ago. And she came out of nowhere. And she must have been that time maybe 30 years old. And she was a t-shirt designer. That's what she designed, t-shirts. And so I asked her, what's your background? She says, I'll tell you the story. My parents live on Park Avenue. And I was walking my parents down Park Avenue. Park Avenue was deserted. So I said to him, and her father, she was an only child. And she said to her father, where is everyone? So her father says to her, her parents say to her, don't you know today's Yom Kippur? She says, what's Yom Kippur? He says, it's a day where all Jews are in temple. She says, if all Jews are in temple, why aren't we in temple? They didn't answer. They didn't answer her, but she understood there was a problem. If all Jews are in temple, regardless of your affiliation, why isn't she in temple? And she's not even aware of what Yom Kippur is. So out of curiosity, she started to do her research. Ultimately, she was very strongly interested in becoming observant. And she did become observant. She became fully observant, this woman. Her father was a very, very wealthy man. She's an only child. And her father had all the export rights to South America for all farm equipment. Deer equipment, which agricultural equipment, he was the distributor to all South American countries. He had the distributorship for them. Very wealthy man. Her father was dying of throat cancer. So she came to me, she says to me, what could I suggest for my father, which would be in his best interest before he dies? So I said to her, this is what you could tell your father. I'm sure he's never put on tefillin before in his life. Let him put on a pair of tefillin once before he dies. Very important. The second thing you should do is bequeath some money to Jewish education. You pick it, but it should be bequeathed to Jewish education. And if she does both those things, it'll be in his best interest. That's what I said. That's what I advised her. She's an only daughter, you understand? And she goes to her father. What do you think he said? He turned it down on both. Would not put on the tefillin, would not bequeath, not a dime, not a penny to Jewish education. Understand? So, as they said, he bit the dust. He left everything over for his wife. Okay? He's sitting Shiva. They're sitting Shiva on Park Avenue. And I go up to pay a Shiva visit because the daughter is sitting Shiva. So the mother, out of respect for the daughter, she's in the apartment when the daughter's sitting on a low stool, sitting Shiva. She's wearing sneakers or man-made fiber shoes. And there's some people, they're relatives of hers, which are of the ilk of the parents. And they say to me, you realize everybody has a choice. One doesn't have to be observant. One has a right to deny God. I said, you're right. You have a right. But just as you have a right to deny God, your cousin or your daughter has a right to recognize God. It goes both ways. Here you're preaching one way, but you yourself, you're contradictory. If you have a right to do as you choose, as you have a right to deny, wasn't she have the right to acknowledge? This is the story. It turned out, ultimately, this man, through this discussion, he had a son who became a Baal Tshuva, who was a lawyer. He himself ultimately became observant. And before he became observant, his wife passed away. Understanding we all have choices. Obviously, take one side of the equation. But you have a right to deny God. You can't force anything on anyone. Nobody's forcing anything on anybody. But as much as you have a right to force, you can't force the person to deny if the person chooses to acknowledge. And literally, that's what it's all about. Hopefully, we'll take advantage of the opportunity. Okay. I'm ready for.
Thank you.